When we think of medieval warfare, we imagine soldiers fearing the enemy's blade. But on the battlefield, there were fates far worse than death ones that haunted warriors long before the fight began. Number 1. Maiming and permanent injury. Medieval soldiers often feared the idea of surviving with a ruined body far more than they feared dying outright. A crushed knee from a mace, a severed hand from a sword blow, or a spear wound that tore into the shoulder could mean the end of a man's ability to work, fight, or even feed himself. Archaeological evidence from medieval battlefields shows countless cases of shattered bones, deep blade cuts, and blunt force fractures. Many injuries were aimed at disabling rather than killing, especially strikes to legs and arms that could take a man out of the fight but leave him alive to suffer. Visible wounds on the face were especially feared, not just for the pain, but for the lifelong mark they left. A disfigured face could change how others treated you, affecting marriage prospects, employment, and standing in the community. Arrows posed their own risks. Bodkin arrowheads could pierce chainmail and lodge deep in bone or muscle. Removing them was difficult, often tearing more tissue, leaving joints stiff or nerves permanently damaged. Battlefield medicine tried to keep pace, but surgical knowledge was limited. The best trained surgeons could set bones, sew cuts, and use herbal mixtures to dull pain, but they had little defense against infection. Even small wounds could become fatal within weeks due to septicemia. Some surgeons, like Hugh of Lucca and his students, began experimenting with cleaning wounds and using wine-soaked dressings, which improved survival rates for those lucky enough to reach them. But most soldiers had to rely on cauterization, crude bandages, or whatever help comrades could provide in the field. For many who survived, bones healed badly. Evidence from excavated skeletons shows crooked limbs, fused joints, and signs of arthritis from improperly healed fractures. This kind of permanent damage meant a man could no longer ride a horse, wield a weapon, or work the land effectively, stripping him of his role in both war and peacetime life. In the rigid structure of medieval society, losing the ability to labor was devastating. Wealthy knights might secure a ransom or pension, but ordinary foot soldiers had no such safety net. Disability often led to poverty, dependence on family, or begging. Soldiers saw these fates firsthand when camps turned into grim makeshift hospitals after a battle. Long lines formed for the barber surgeon, who would probe wounds, cut away dead flesh, or cauterize with red-hot iron. The smell of burned flesh, the screams of patients, and the knowledge that fever and gangrene might still come later, created an atmosphere of dread. Some survivors also faced long-term neurological damage from head injuries. Impaired vision, poor balance, and memory loss were common after severe blows to the skull. Even if a soldier returned home alive, he might never be the same mentally or physically. Manuals like the Chirurgia Magna offered detailed instructions for treating compound fractures and arrow wounds, but without antiseptics or sterile environments, success rates were low. The weapons most likely to leave men maimed were ironically the ones designed to bypass armor without killing instantly. Maces, warhammers, and poleaxes could crush bones and dislocate joints while leaving organs untouched, producing survivors who would spend the rest of their lives limping or unable to lift a shield. Siege warfare only added to the risks. Falling masonry, boiling oil, or heavy projectiles from trebuchets could break bones in ways even skilled surgeons couldn't repair. The aftermath of battles also brought danger. Dirty water, crowded living conditions, and poor sanitation turned manageable wounds into slow killers. Soldiers knew that survival often meant living with constant pain, losing their role in society, and facing the pity or disdain of others. That reality, more than the idea of a quick death, was what haunted them before stepping onto the battlefield. Number 2. Captivity and torture. To a medieval soldier, the worst fate wasn't a quick end on the field, but the long, uncertain grind of being taken alive, because capture turned a fighter into currency, leverage, and sometimes a lesson to terrify others. The rules favored the valuable knights, bannerets, wealthy men-at-arms who could expect ransom negotiations, parole on sworn oath, and a chain of guarantors back home. Yet even for them, the process could ruin a family, as relatives sold parcels of land, pledged future harvests, and borrowed at harsh rates while the captive waited in a keep or town prison, watching seasons pass. For common infantry, archers, or levy spearmen, there was often no market, which meant forced labor in siege works, hauling stones and timber, digging trenches under guard, or a march to coastal markets where prisoners could be sold into servitude on estates, or pulled to the oars of galleys, a sentence measured in blisters, salt sores, and years. Fear sharpened around interrogation. Not the sensational devices popular imagination fixates on, but simple, relentless coercion binding, suspension, beating, sleep deprivation, cold, and hunger methods designed to pry out gate codes, supply routes, and the names of officers or local allies. And because information had immediate tactical value, captors used intimidation quickly, sometimes in front of other prisoners, to break morale without leaving marks that might reduce resale value. Mutilation existed as a warning, and a policy tool ears and noses cut to mark deserters or enemy scouts, the right hand taken to stop a bowman's return to service, blinding used to neutralize experienced leaders and send a message to towns thinking about resistance. A disfigured survivor spread the story faster than any herald, and soldiers knew the shame of returning home, visibly damaged, could stalk them longer than pain itself. Ritualized humiliation could be just as corrosive. Captives paraded in chains through market squares, forced to kneel before a banner, made to carry captured standards upside down, or shaved to signal subjugation. None of this killed, but it unmade a man's public identity, and in honor-based communities, that loss stuck like a second set of shackles. Conditions inside holding sites, castle undercrofts, town jails, monastic cells requisitioned in wartime were an education in slow punishment. Cramped rooms, poor ventilation, shared straw, lice, and a steady risk of dysentery. Guards rationed food unevenly, favoring high-value prisoners who could pay for better bedding or a servant, and leaving the rest to barter clothing or future labor for scraps. A soldier might enter captivity strong and leave months later weak, half-starved, and sick, even if no blow ever fell. Parole offered one slender path. A captive knight could be released on oath to gather his ransom, sworn not to fight until the sum was paid, but breaking parole meant dishonor that closed doors to future service and might lead former comrades to shun him. Meanwhile, the debt itself could distort a career, pushing veterans into riskier campaigns, or mercenary contracts to claw back what their families had spent. Some captors pressed prisoners into auxiliary roles, camp carpenters, teamsters, even reluctant guides to local fords and byways, raising a different anxiety, that former comrades would brand them collaborators if they ever returned. And if wars crossed religious frontiers, the fear deepened with language barriers, unknown laws, and the possibility of permanent enslavement far from home. Where letters might never reach in ransom, brokers had little access. Soldiers also worried about the legal gray zone between quarter and no quarter. Surrender terms could be honored safe conduct in exchange for laying down arms, or voided after tempers cooled and commanders reconsidered costs, and stories of garrisons granted mercy 1 month and slaughtered the next traveled quickly along campaign roads, eroding trust. On open fields, dropping weapons and raising hands did not guarantee survival if pursuit had been bloody, or if a commander wished to make an example. Torture, when applied, wasn't always about secrets. Sometimes it served as staged theater measured, public, and targeted to warn towns against aiding raiders or to punish communities after ambushes. And that predictability made it more frightening, because men could imagine exactly how their own capture might be used. Yet even without overt cruelty, the prolonged not knowing was its own torment. Not knowing if a letter had reached home, if a lord would pay, if the next buyer would be harsher, if a swap would fall through at the last moment. All of this sat on top of spiritual and social anxieties. A prisoner could miss sacraments, fail to care for aging parents, or see his betrothal collapse. If ransom failed and sale followed, he might be absorbed into an unfamiliar household with no route back. Measured against a battlefield death that ended pain and fixed reputation, captivity threatened a slow unspooling of status, agency, and ties, years of being used rather than simply defeated. Which is why so many soldiers stepped into the melee, more afraid of chains than of steel. Number 3. Starvation. During sieges. In a siege, fear worked slowly, measured not by charging cavalry, but by the shrinking pile of grain in a storeroom, and the ache that made armor feel twice as heavy, because once the gates closed, the calendar turned into arithmetic. How many mouths? How many barrels? How many days until the last ration? Commanders ordered an immediate census, locked granaries, sealed wine cellars, and posted guards on mills. Yet everyone knew the math rarely favored the garrison. The besiegers' first move was to choke supply lines burning fields, tearing up roads, blocking river traffic, and raiding outlying farms, so that even a successful sally brought back less each week. With mills outside the walls disabled, defenders scrambled to keep a few handquerns turning, but grinding was slow, exhausting work that tied up able bodies, while soldiers were needed on the parapets. Rations tightened in steps. Whole loaves became half, then black bread stretched with bran,